Hello, and welcome to Anime Audio Commentary. Today I'll be commenting on episode 7 of Cyberpunk Edgerunners. If you'd like to watch along, then start watching now. So last we left off, things were in a rather unfortunate state, Main's dead, Dorio's dead, and David's like one micro expression away from making that face from Fire Punch. But it seems like, a new status quo has been reached. David's still doing the whole Cyberpunk thing, but now he's working more closely with Rebecca and, some new guy. What's interesting is that it's very clearly that some amount of time has passed. David's bulked up. He's using guns a whole lot more frequently and with less caution than he would before. So, it's not really clear, at least initially, how much time has passed. If I had to hazard a guess, knowing what I do about Cyberpunk and that, people live fast and die young, I can't imagine too much time has elapsed. So I guess just to put a fine point on things, Kiwi is still hanging out with the group here, but we haven't seen anything of Lucy so far. And, given how she was acting last episode, she wasn't exactly on super great terms, she didn't quite seem like herself. Although, interestingly enough, I think we've seen these guys before in one of the montage scenes. I can only imagine that, given that they've shown up multiple times now, they're something of a faction in Cyberpunk, but I don't know who they are or what their deal is, other than the fact that they seem to like replacing lots of the flesh in their faces. I guess, seeing as how they have a propensity for that, it makes hacking them rather debilitating. Now, I feel like this is a bit more bombastic than David would normally be willing to do, Like, he's gone and guns blazing, and even more than that, he seems to be less reckless and impetuous and more level-headed. So it seems like whatever's happened in the intervening time, David's grown up a lot. And I guess that's sort of I guess, speaks to, like the general motif of Cyberpunk, live fast and die young and all that, the star that burns the brightest is all the more beautiful for its brevity. Like, a big theme of the first few episodes is that David's talking about how, he's built different, he's special and all that. And it seems like, there's definitely a little bit of merit to that. I really do like these slow motion sequences showing, I guess, like the after images of the other frames. It is really interesting. And it is also nice to see that David has incorporated Maine's augmetics into his own body. And Rebecca's also making it pretty clear that he has some nifty leg implants too. Given how much David likes chipping in chrome, I can only imagine at this point that he's gotta be, like, if not a majority augmetic, darn close. So it's gotta be like, what, the arms, the legs, the spine, the lungs. Looks like some more stuff on his face and the rest of his body. Now, it is interesting. This mission is very clearly not altruistic, They were paid for this job, they had a client, but it's nice that they went out of their way to, like, save someone, rather than just, doing the more standard stuff they had been doing of, stealing, trying to get information, kidnapping, and all that. I guess what's also interesting is that David has sort of become the de facto leader. He's the point of contact for fixers now. And I guess it only makes sense, David was seemingly, the only person who really knew everybody before everything hit the fan. Now, I do know that this is written by Imaishi. Cyberpunk Edgerunners as a whole, and Imaishi was the guy who directed and I believe wrote Gurren Lagann way back in 2007. I can't help but draw a little bit of a parallel between David and Simon in that they were both sort of thrust into a leadership role that they probably weren't all that prepared for. And, Simon eventually did hit his stride and did better than anybody could have reasonably expected. And at least for the time being, it seems like David has done the same. And I guess, Kiwi is sort of, speaking for the audience here a little bit, didn't think you had it in you to do this. That indicates to me that perhaps this is sort of like the first mission or something like that. The first mission where everybody's back in business. And I guess just to put a fine point on things, Lucy still hasn't been herself ever since the incident. And it sounds like she's not really doing much net running. Or, much of anything, really. It's kind of unfortunate. So I feel like we're being dangled a little plot thread here. Lucy doesn't really talk about her past. And, a lot of netrunners have reason to not talk about their past. Now, unfortunately, Lucy's not around. And Rebecca's kind of taking advantage of that, even though it's not really working out for her. She's trying to get David to, hop on the dance floor and spend time with him and all that. And, she's making it pretty clear she doesn't like just being friends, but, you know, the poor girl, like, she's kind of intruding, and, you know, David's too polite to really say something. So interestingly, the Ripper Doc here, you know, even he says that these arms David got from Man, you know, they're kind of junk, and that David could definitely afford something better, but, you know, he wants it for sentimental reasons, and can you really blame him, honestly? So this is an interesting statement. You know, not only does David have an insane affinity for cyberware, he says explicitly he feels better in metal than in his own skin. And that's interesting, you know. It only makes sense that the Ripper Doc would bring up Atom Smasher. He's kind of like the big boogeyman of everything, you know? Like, he's basically about as much machine as you can get, and he's sort of like Arasaka's like big scary pit bull on a leash. You know, he just basically kills people. You know, he's a mercenary, he's a solo technically, I think, in-game. And, you know, he's just somebody who's not to be messed with. And, you know, you can see the parallels a little bit here. Like, he's got an insane affinity for cyberware. And the reason why he's never gone cyber psycho, it's purported, is just because he's already kind of a psycho anyways. So he and Adam are sort of approaching the same thing from two different directions. You know, Adam Smasher, he didn't really have any humanity to lose, so cyberpsychosis, you know, it's either meaningless or the norm. Whereas David, I guess he can adapt to it, you know. It is very interesting. So what's very interesting is that now Faraday has approached David about presumably taking up the old job. And, you know, it's probably not a good idea for David to get involved with this guy, considering that he's, I don't know, like, he's definitely scummy like everybody in Night City is. But, I don't know. Faraday never struck me as particularly trustworthy, so it seems like perhaps David should, you know, use a fair bit of caution before interacting with this guy. Alright, so things are getting interesting, you know. This job would effectively have David working for one megacorp against another, you know. And that's kind of what, like, a lot of the conflict in Cyberpunk boils down to. At least, you know, like, heavy conflict like war. It's corporation against corporation. So it seems like this is all sort of going back to how Kiwi managed to breach some Arasaka encryption. Faraday is very interested in her, I guess for obvious reasons, but I feel like, you know, this interest should be taken with great caution. You know, certainly Faraday doesn't have any good intentions here, but, you know, if there's like a new up-and-coming netrunner who can beat corporate encryption, you know, that's gotta be worth its weight in gold. So that's an interesting turn of phrase, you know, good things come to those who act. I feel like he's sort of deliberately inverting the proverb. You know, I also feel like nothing good is going to come out of rash action. So now at home with Lucy here, it seems like David's living in some pretty swanky accommodation. And I guess he's also living with Lucy, you know, that's pretty nice, you know. They do have, I guess, an ongoing relationship now, even if we haven't seen too much of it. So this is interesting, you know, Lucy's kind of being coy about the whole, you know, oh, I don't really want to be a netrunner thing, even though she very clearly has the aptitude and all that. And, you know, Lucy strikes me as kind of interesting as a netrunner in that she kind of likes the low-tech approach, I guess, you know. The ice bath isn't exactly state of the art. Man, you know, I feel like there's something here about, you know, them going stargazing, getting outside the city. You know, there's a definite sort of parallel here about the star that burns the brightest being more beautiful for its brevity, and the fact that, you know, David is such a rising star in the cyberpunk scene. I don't know. There's a lot of stuff here. And I don't think I can quite articulate what it is I'm thinking, but, you know, sure is a coincidence, you know? So it seems like Kiwi's intuition was kind of correct. There's definitely something in Lucy's past that she doesn't want to share. And as it turns out, she's sort of like a, I don't know what you would call it, like an Arasaka asset, a corporate edgerunner. It's kind of messed up in a way that, you know, a megacorp would take in orphans, raise them to be netrunners, and use them as corporate assets. So unfortunately, in classic Arasaka fashion, it seems like the assignments that awaited these netrunners was decidedly not good, you know. Yeah, there we have it, you know, they were forced to dive into the old net. And yeah, you know, Lucy even says it herself, there's demons and stuff. It's definitely not a place you want to be. And I'd imagine it's not really a good place to send children either, even if they are trained netrunners. Now what's really interesting is that the reason they were diving into the old net was to look for, like, lost information. That is something that I find very interesting, you know, the idea that knowledge can be lost and never regained. Because, you know, it's hard to conceive of when storing information is so comparatively easy in this day and age. But nonetheless, information can still be lost permanently. So, you know, it seems like there's another interesting parallel here. You know, Lucy, she doesn't want to chase somebody else's dream. hence why she, decided to bust out of Arasaka's facility. But David is somebody who's perfectly willing to chase someone else's dreams or help them chase their dreams. It's a bit of an interesting contrast between Arasaka and David in that, they are kind of similar. As much as one man and one monstrous megacorp can be. So it seems like Lucy never really had much in the way of a home or a family, or really any sort of a stable life. Now, what's interesting is that it doesn't necessarily seem like Arasaka's chasing her anymore, but nonetheless, I'm sure she's still on some list somewhere saying, hey, this person is a rogue Arasaka asset, recover them or destroy them. That's not a happy existence. So, I guess the nice crux of all of this is that in having met David, Lucy has something else to live for other than for herself. But, there's other bad stuff going on in the background. Faraday here is indicating that some netrunner somewhere has deliberately corrupted some data, and I think we can make the inference that that data pertains to David. And, we know it was Lucy who did that. So it seems like the plot is continuing to thicken in regards to David and Arasaka, Faraday, and that Militech job. Something's brewing, and the odds of it being good are vanishingly slim. So, for one reason or another, Lucy seems to be taking it upon herself to, I guess, eliminate any other netrunner who could undo what she did, presumably in a bid to protect David. It's a bit of a laudable goal, but I don't know, I think I've got the benefit of hindsight here. Alright, well that's it for this episode. If you've enjoyed it, then by all means, tune in for the next one. See you, Space Cowboy.